Now, 33 weeks into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the conflict intensified as the Kremlin's forces showered the Ukrainian capital with missile attacks over the past few days, accusing Kyiv of a terrorist attack on a bridge linking Russia and Crimea. Now, tension has risen even further to new heights as Moscow officials continue to float the idea of using nuclear weapons. We discussed the status of the war and where it could be headed with none other than American historian and scholar Dr. Ronald G. Suny, William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished Professor of History and Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan, who has pioneered studies on non-Russian nationalities of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, authoring books including The Soviet Experiment and The Making of the Georgian Nation. It's lovely to have you on our show. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
It's my great pleasure to be here with you.
And Professor, as you know, Russia's continued to call its actions in Ukraine a special military operation. And from the massive missile attacks we've seen over the past few days, how far do you think Vladimir Putin is willing to go, and what risks do you think he's prepared to take?
When a country like Russia or a person like Putin is cornered or thinks that they're in some kind of dangerous or humiliating position, they are likely to strike out. This is something we've seen before, and we'll probably see again. It happened in 2008 when the Georgian president launched an attack on South Ossetia, which was in Russian hands, and Russia responded very brutally. And the same thing can happen here. There are a number of provocations recently, most importantly, the bombing, probably by someone connected with Ukraine, of the bridge over the Kerch Straits. And that bridge was a favored project of Vladimir Putin and was an important connection before this recent war. Now they have another land bridge to Crimea from Russia, but it's still a very important artery. And so one cannot predict how far Putin will go, but he will not, I am confident in saying this, he will not allow Russia to be defeated. He will do whatever is necessary to come into a position where he can claim some kind of victory.
And your president, US President Joe Biden, he told CNN that he doubted whether Russian President Vladimir Putin would use a tactical nuclear weapon. Would you agree with this assessment?
I do agree with that. President Biden had used the word Armageddon to describe what would be happening if there were a nuclear exchange between the great superpowers. And he had to sort of walk that back because it was very frightening to people. Armageddon, something that you find at the end of the Christian Bible. And so he made this statement, which is a much more reasoned and careful statement. Tactical nuclear weapons, or nuclear weapons in general, which have not been used since the Americans bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, are largely what I would call symbolic weapons. They're used as a threat, but they are not very practical to be used unless your state is facing an existential crisis. That is, it's about to be destroyed, something like that. And then a government, this hasn't happened in the last 70 years, but then a government might be willing to use it. So I'm fairly confident that this is a gesture. It's an important gesture. It sends a signal, but that it practically is unlikely that a nuclear escalation will occur, at least not for the moment.
And Professor Suny, there have been many questions about the Russian leader's state of mind, or even just how aware he is of the war situation. But President Biden said that Putin is a rational actor who has miscalculated badly. But if this is true, then why does he continue to make such catastrophic choices?
That is an excellent question. I love the way you just put it. That is, everyone's trying to psychoanalyze and analyze in any other way Vladimir Putin. He's been called a fascist, a Eurasianist. He's been called insane, isolated, delusional, and so forth. But if in fact you look at him carefully, up until February 24th of this year, up until the invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin was thought by most analysts to be exactly a rational actor, cautious, Sometimes he overextended. Sometimes he did things rationally. I would say the seizure of Crimea, the way he did it in 2014, was a rash and sudden, uncarefully thought out move that cost Russia plenty. But otherwise, he's been very careful. And actually, one of his major goals for a long time, remember, this man came to power in 2000, the year 2000. He's now in his over 20 years in power, has been that he's wanted to integrate Russia, to make it great again as part of the capitalist world, as part of the international order. But over time, he became increasingly frustrated by actions of the West, the expansion of NATO, the reduction of the or elimination of certain treaties governing nuclear weapons, the placing of rockets in Romania and Poland, and a number of other things, that the American effort to stop the use of the pipelines, Russian pipelines in the Baltic. And so ultimately became increasingly frustrated. And that frustration was centered on the fact that NATO, though Ukraine is not in NATO, NATO was in Ukraine. The Americans were already training people, supplying weapons to Ukraine before the actual invasion. And so Putin thought there was a danger. The attack was unprovoked. It was unnecessary, and as you indicated in your question, was a blunder, a colossal blunder, because they miscalculated. They thought, we can quickly take Kyiv, we can decapitate the Ukrainian state, we'll get Zelensky or he'll flee to the West. The Americans were actually already planning his escape, and that failed. And now Russia is in a quagmire and in serious trouble.
Well, they often say that war really is a continuation of policy, and in that regard, there should be some kind of goal in terms of, you know, what would actually constitute as winning the war. But when we talk about which side is winning the war, then what do you think really defines winning for each side at this point?
That's a question that's almost impossible to answer, because it's not clear why he went to war in the first place. Was it a preventive war? He talked about it being a preventive war. That is, I'm going to prevent Ukraine from not only joining NATO, that was not really on the table at the moment, but I'm going to prevent it from becoming a Platzdam, a staging ground for the West. And he was against Ukraine being integrated either into the European Union or into NATO. So this war was, at one level, a preventive war. But now that they're in the war and they've illegitimately annexed 5 different provinces of Ukraine, keeping Crimea as well, that means that the goal or the definition of winning has escalated. It now means a territorial grab, a seizure of land, an imperialist, colonialist move. And that's unacceptable to Ukraine. So for Ukraine, it's clear what victory would be. Maximum victory would be getting rid of all the Russians, pushing them back out of Ukraine and even out of Crimea if it's possible. It's less clear what victory would mean for Putin. Probably, if he could get it, and by the way, we should anticipate that though the Russians are doing badly right now, there's likely to be a counteroffensive, and Russia will make another move, an effort to turn the tide and move Russian forces forward. But what it seems to be, the idea of victory for Russia is taking and annexing those provinces, Luhansk, Donetsk, and Kherson, etc., that they now claim are part of Russia.
Well, over here in South Korea as well, we're entering the colder months and the temperature's dropping significantly. And there are concerns that this war is going to stretch into the winter. I mean, do you see this war intensifying even further? Or do you think there's still some kind of room for diplomatic talks to ease the tension?
I've tried over and over again to be optimistic. I've tried over and over again to look for signs of negotiation. And there are signs that the Russians are more interested in negotiation at the moment because they're doing badly and because they occupy parts of Ukraine. Then there is less interest in that in Kyiv or in the West. The Americans and NATO have only one policy, which is continued escalation and arming of Ukraine. There's almost no alternative to that and no openings there. There have been hints that Russia was interested in negotiation, but on what terms? Would those terms, taking land from a neighbor through a war of aggression for no good reason, would that be something that you could negotiate on? So the only hope I see is that there could be a ceasefire in place where people would put down their arms, they would go to the tables, probably in Istanbul, and begin to talk about what a final solution would be. If I had to make a prediction, I'd say two things. One, the war is going to go on through the winter. The front is going to go back and forth. The Russians will win back some of that territory. The Ukrainians will suffer more. But in general, both sides are going to be caught in a very fierce struggle. And the second thing I would say is this is not a time where there's serious possibilities of negotiation. We have to wait and see what will happen after this stalemate of war and much more destruction occurs, sadly.
Well, Professor, regardless of the outcome of the war, it seems that Russia is going to be rather lonely in the world. How should the West really then prepare to deal with a post-war Russia?
Post-war Russia, if Putin is still in power, is going to be difficult to deal with. If Putin should be removed or die, then one could imagine the West thinking, you know what, maybe we should think more positively about reintegrating the largest country in the world into the international security system. And maybe we can try to do something that we didn't do after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that is exclude Russia, expand NATO eastward, and eventually pose what at least the Kremlin thought was a threat to their security. So Russia can't be, you can't neglect Russia. You can't neglect this power that is a nuclear power that occupies such a large part of the globe, and which, by the way, is loosely allied with other nations. That is, most importantly, China and Modi's India. Both of those countries are not happy with this war. They've made it clear to Putin that they don't like what he's doing in Ukraine, and yet they're remaining somewhat tied to Putin, and they don't want to see the American as the giant and unchallenged hegemon in the world. On that issue, a multilateral, multipolar world, China, Russia, and India are on the same page. Maybe that's what eventually will come out of this. Less dominance by NATO and the United States, and more consultation, more egalitarian relations between the other superpowers in the world.
Well, some were hoping that China would be more involved, although as it's, as you mentioned, remained quite tight-lipped about the situation. But, well, many see China as having this influence over the Kremlin, which is now regarded as its junior partner to really thwart the Western world order, as you said. But how do you think Beijing is really seeing the situation right now, and to what extent do you think they're going to really involve themselves in the situation?
Beijing and the Chinese did best when the world was stable, when there was peace, when there was a real global system, no punitive tariffs, no isolation by the United States, and they were then doing gloriously economically, growing faster than any country in the world, and they were beginning to expand their influence through the Belt and Road program and by building up their military, etc. So to my mind, Xi Jinping would prefer stability and predictability. And therefore, the war in Ukraine gives us just the opposite. It destabilizes. It makes the future unpredictable. And that's not something that China needs. Now, China also feels, as it moves and becomes increasingly nationalistic and worried about its non-Han peoples, like the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, in that present state, China is also wary of the United States, which it sees as increasingly hostile. And so we see these symbolic and dangerous military actions, as what happened after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. We see those kinds of actions in the Taiwan Strait. But in my view, if the world were quieter, if the world were more stable, if the United States were a little bit, as I would put it, less pushy, we might be able to deal with China in a much more sensible and rational way. I see that struggle as two-sided. I don't think China or the United States is unilaterally guilty of this freezing of relationships, but I don't think there's any necessary, any unavoidable clash of interests between the two, except one. And that is that the strongest, richest, most powerful country in the world, the global hegemon, the United States, fears rivals, any rival, anywhere in the globe. And therefore, it's very suspicious and fearful of China, a rising China.
Well, it looks like certainly Xi Jinping isn't going away. He's likely to extend his term just over the weekend, I suppose, at the National Party Congress. So we'll have more to continue to observe there. But that was Dr. Ronald G. Suny, Distinguished Professor of History and Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan. It's an honor to have you on our program. Thank you so much for your time today.
It's a great pleasure to be here. This is such a good and intelligent discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Bye-bye.
And thank you also to our viewers from around the world. We'll be back tomorrow with more insights on issues making headlines. And, well, have a good one wherever you are. Goodbye.